man hid for 44 years, and in the end he was found by a family tree he had never seen. He had never given his DNA to the police. His profile was not in any criminal database. The first crimes linked to him happened when Richard Nixon was still president, and by the time investigators walked up his driveway, most of the detectives who had hunted him were retired or gone. And still, on a spring afternoon in 2018, they came to a quiet street in a Sacramento suburb, and they knew exactly who he was. They had learned his name from strangers, people who had spat into a plastic tube because they were curious about their ancestors. How does that happen? How can a man be caught by other people's blood? To understand it, we have to go back to California, and to a decade when nobody could find him at all. It started with burglaries. In 1974, in the farming town of Visalia, someone began slipping into houses at night. He took strange things: a single earring when the pair was on the table, a handful of coins when there was cash beside them. He moved furniture and left it in the wrong place so people would know, in the morning, that a stranger had stood in their kitchen in the dark. Then it became worse. In 1976, the attacks began in the suburbs east of Sacramento, and for 3 years a community learned to sleep badly. In 1979, the pattern moved south, along the coast, and the burglaries became murders. He collected names the way a legend collects them. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker. For years, nobody knew they belonged to the same person. Prosecutors would eventually describe the scale as staggering: 13 known murders, nearly 50 rapes, 87 victims across 11 California counties between 1975 and 1986. The details belong to the people who lived through them, and we will leave those details with them. What matters here is what he did after, because in 1986 he stopped. No final crime, no message, no arrest. He simply stopped and stepped back into an ordinary life. And for the next 3 decades he was a neighbor, a shopper, a man mowing a lawn. That is the part investigators could never forgive. Not that he escaped, that he was allowed to grow old. So what did they have? Fingerprints that matched nothing, shoe impressions, composite sketches of a face nobody recognized, thousands of tips, and, in a handful of evidence lockers around the state, small preserved samples that in the 1970s nobody knew how to read. Then came DNA. And for a while it looked like the answer. In the 1990s, a criminalist in Contra Costa County named Paul Holes pulled the old case files out of storage and started reading. He was young then. He would work the case, on and off, for around 24 years. And in 2001, DNA testing did something remarkable. It proved that the man who had terrorized Sacramento and the man who had murdered couples in Southern California were one person, one offender, one long, unbroken line of harm. It was a landmark. It was also a dead end. Here is the thing people misunderstand about DNA. A DNA match is not a name. When police say a sample matched the database, they mean a national system called CODIS, which holds profiles taken from people who have already been convicted or arrested. If your profile is not in that system, your DNA can sit in a laboratory for 40 years and tell investigators everything about you except who you are. He was not in the system. He had never been arrested for anything that would put him there, so the case went quiet again. In 2013, a writer named Michelle McNamara gave him the name that finally stuck, the Golden State Killer, in a magazine article, and spent years chasing him through paperwork and message boards. She died in 2016. Her book was published in 2018. She did not live to see the answer, and the answer came within weeks of it reaching shelves. By 2017, Paul Holes was near the end of his career. He had a sample. He had no suspect, and he had a question that sounds obvious now and sounded absurd then. If the killer isn't in the database, what about his relatives? Around that time, Holes was introduced to a retired patent attorney named Barbara Rae-Venter. She was New Zealand-born, she had a doctorate in biology, and in retirement she had taken up genealogy as a hobby and become frighteningly good at it. She had already used consumer DNA results to solve something extraordinary, giving an identity back to a woman who had been abducted as a small child and had grown up never knowing her real name. She was not a detective. She was better than that for this. She could read a family. So here is what investigative genetic genealogy actually is, in plain words. You take DNA from a crime scene and process it the way a commercial ancestry test does, reading hundreds of thousands of markers instead of the 20 or so a criminal database uses. Then you upload that profile to a public website where hobbyists share their own results to find cousins, and you do not look for the criminal. You look for his family. The sample they used came from 1980, a kit from Ventura County, preserved after the murders of Lyman and Charlene Smith, sitting in storage for 38 years, waiting for a technology nobody had imagined when it was collected. They uploaded the profile to GED Match, a free open site where anyone could compare results, and at that time, anyone could search. And there was no killer waiting there. Of course there wasn't. What came back were distant matches, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who had never met him, never heard of him, and shared with him only a great-great-great-grandparent from the early 1800s. Imagine that for a moment. A stranger in another state, curious about a surname, uploads a file, and somewhere in that file is a thread that leads to a house in Citrus Heights. Now the hard part, because a distant cousin is not a suspect. A distant cousin is a door into a family, and the family has to be built by hand. That is what the team did through the winter and spring. Obituaries, census records, marriage licenses, newspaper archives, old address listings. They worked backwards from the matches to the common ancestors, then forwards again, generation by generation, drawing descendants until the tree held roughly 1,000 people, 1,000 names, somewhere in them one man. Then the filters came down, and this is the part that feels like watching a net close. Wrong sex, gone. Born too late, gone. Born too early, gone. Living in Ohio in 1978, gone. What survived that sieve was not a crowd, it was 2 men. One of them was tested and cleared. One was left. Joseph James DeAngelo, 72 years old, a Navy veteran, and, in the years the attacks were happening, a serving police officer in Exeter and then in Auburn, until he was fired in 1979 for shoplifting. The man they had been hunting had been wearing a badge while they hunted him. But a family tree is not evidence. A tree is a hypothesis, and this is the step people forget. The genealogy did not convict him. It only told investigators where to point. So they watched him, and they waited for him to throw something away. They took a sample from a car door handle, then another from his rubbish. Ordinary discarded things, given up in public, requiring no warrant. Those samples went to the laboratory and were compared to the DNA left at crime scenes decades earlier. It matched. On the 24th of April 2018, officers arrested him outside his home in Citrus Heights. There was no chase, there was no siege, an old man in a quiet street, and it was over. On the 29th of June, 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 kidnapping charges, and admitted dozens of rapes for which the statute of limitations had long expired. On the 21st of August, 2020, he was sentenced to 11 consecutive terms of life without parole. The hearing was held in a university ballroom because no courtroom in Sacramento was large enough to hold everyone he had hurt. They spoke for 3 days. He sat in a wheelchair and listened, and then he was taken away to die in prison. And what did it change? Everything, almost immediately. Before April 2018, investigative genetic genealogy was a hobbyist technique for finding birth parents. After it, it became a standard tool. Within a couple of years, more than 150 suspects had been identified the same way in cases that had been cold for decades. Jane and John Does named at last. Families finally told what happened. It changed the rules too, because the people whose DNA cracked the case never volunteered for it. They wanted a family tree, not a manhunt. GED Match moved to a system where users have to opt in before police can search their data. The United States Department of Justice issued an interim policy in 2019, limiting the technique to violent crimes and unidentified remains. Some states went further. The argument that started in that Sacramento driveway is still running. You cannot keep your DNA private because your cousins own a copy of it. He counted on being forgotten. He counted on the men who hunted him retiring, on the paperwork yellowing, on time doing what he could not do himself. He hid for 44 years, and he was undone by a family tree he had never seen, drawn by strangers who only wanted to know where they came from.